This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Gesine. The Middle Temple Murder by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 22. The Blank Past. Jessie Aylmore came forward to meet Spargo with ready confidence. The elder girl hung back diffidently. "May we speak to you?" said Jessie. "We have come on purpose to speak to you. Evelyn didn't want to come, but I made her come." Spargo shook hands silently with Evelyn Aylmore and motioned them both to follow him. He took them straight upstairs to his room, and bestowed them in his easiest chairs before he addressed them. "I've only just got back to town," he said abruptly. "I was sorry to hear the news about your father. That's what's brought you here, of course. But I'm afraid I can't do much." "I told you that we had no right to trouble Mr. Spargo, Jessie," said Evelyn Aylmore. "What can he do to help us?" Jessie shook her head impatiently. "The Watchman's about the most powerful paper in London, isn't it?" she said. "And isn't Mr. Spargo writing all these articles about the Marbury case? Mr. Spargo, you must help us." Spargo sat down at his desk and began turning over the letters and papers which had accumulated during his absence. "To be absolutely frank with you," he said presently, "I don't see how anybody's going to help, so long as your father keeps up that mystery about the past." "That," said Evelyn quietly, "is exactly what Ronald says, Jessie. But we can't make our father speak, Mr. Spargo. That he is as innocent as we are of this terrible crime we are certain, but we don't know why he wouldn't answer the questions put to him at the inquest. And we know no more than you know or anyone knows, and though I have begged my father to speak, he won't say a word. We saw his danger, Ronald, Mr. Bretton, told us, and we implored him to tell everything he knew about Mr. Marbury, but so far he has simply laughed at the idea that he had anything to do with the murder, or could be arrested for it, and now he's locked up," said Spargo in his usual matter-of-fact fashion. "Well, there are people who have to be saved from themselves, you know. Perhaps you'll have to save your father from the consequences of his own, shall we say obstinacy? Now look here, between ourselves, how much do you know about your father's past?" The two sisters looked at each other and then at Spargo. "Nothing," said the elder. "Absolutely nothing," said the younger. "Answer a few plain questions," said Spargo. "I'm not going to print your replies, or make use of them in any way. I'm only asking the questions with a desire to help you. Have you any relations in England?" "None that we know of," replied Evelyn. "Nobody you could go to for information about the past?" asked Spargo. "No, nobody." Spargo drummed his fingers on his blotting pad. He was thinking hard. "How old is your father?" he asked suddenly. "He was 59 a few weeks ago," answered Evelyn. "And how old are you, and how old is your sister?" demanded Spargo. "I am 20, and Jessie is nearly 19. Where were you born?" "Both of us at San Gregorio, which is in the San Jose province of Argentina, north of Montevideo." "Your father was in business there?" "He was in business in the export trade, Mr. Spargo. There's no secret about that. He exported all sorts of things to England, and to France. Skins, hides, wools, dried salts, fruit. That's how he made his money." "You don't know how long he'd been there when you were born?" "No." "Was he married when he went out there?" "No, he wasn't. We do know that. He's told us the circumstances of his marriage because they were romantic. When he sailed from England to Buenos Aires he met on the steamer a young lady who, he said, was like himself, relationless and nearly friendless. She was going out to Argentina as a governess. She and my father fell in love with each other, and they were married in Buenos Aires soon after the steamer arrived." "And your mother is dead?" "My mother died before we came to England. I was 8 years old, and Jessie 6, then." "And you came to England how long after that?" 2 years. "So that you've been in England 10 years. And you know nothing whatever of your father's past beyond what you've told me? Nothing, absolutely nothing. Never heard him talk of... You see, according to your account, your father was a man of getting on to 40 when he went out to Argentina. He must have had a career of some sort in this country. Have you never heard him speak about his boyhood? Did he never talk of old times or that sort of thing? I never remember hearing my father speak of any period antecedent to his marriage, replied Evelyn. I once asked him a question about his childhood, said Jessie. He answered that his early days had not been very happy ones, and that he had done his best to forget them. So I never asked him anything again. So that it really comes to this, remarked Spargo. You know nothing whatever about your father, his family, his fortunes, his life, beyond what you yourself have observed since you were able to observe. That's about it, isn't it? I should say that that is exactly it, answered Evelyn. Just so, said Spargo, and therefore, as I told your sister the other day, the public will say that your father has some dark secret behind him, and that Marbury had possession of it, and that your father killed him in order to silence him. That isn't my view. I not only believe your father to be absolutely innocent, but I believe that he knows no more than a child unborn of Marbury's murder, and I'm doing my best to find out who that murderer was. By the by, since you'll see all about it in tomorrow morning's Watchman, I may as well tell you that I've found out who Marbury really was. He... At that moment Spargo's door was opened, and in walked Ronald Bretton. He shook his head at sight of the two sisters. I thought I should find you here, he said. Jessie said she was coming to see you, Spargo. I don't know what good you can do. I don't see what good the most powerful newspaper in the world can do. My God, everything's about as black as ever it can be. Mr. Aylmore, I've just come away from him. His solicitor, Stratton, and I have been with him for an hour, is obstinate as ever. He will not tell more than he has told. Whatever good can you do, Spargo, when he won't speak about that knowledge of Marbury which he must have? Oh, well, said Spargo, perhaps we can give him some information about Marbury. Mr. Aylmore has forgotten that it's not such a difficult thing to rake up the past as he seems to think it is. For example, as I was just telling these young ladies, I myself have discovered who Marbury really was. Bretton started. You have? Without doubt? He exclaimed. Without reasonable doubt. Marbury was an ex-convict. Spargo watched the effect of this sudden announcement. The two girls showed no sign of astonishment or of unusual curiosity. They received the news with as much unconcern as if Spargo had told them that Marbury was a famous musician. But Ronald Bretton started, and it seemed to Spargo that he saw a sense of suspicion dawn in his eyes. Marbury? An ex-convict? He exclaimed. You mean that? Read your Watchman in the morning, said Spargo. You'll find the whole story there. I'm going to write it tonight when you people have gone. It'll make good reading. Evelyn and Jessie Aylmore took Spargo's hint and went away, Spargo seeing them to the door with another assurance of his belief in their father's innocence and his determination to hunt down the real criminal. Ronald Bretton went down with them to the street and saw them into a cab, but in another minute he was back in Spargo's room, as Spargo had expected. He shut the door carefully behind him and turned to Spargo with an eager face. I say, Spargo, is that really so? He asked. About Marbury being an ex-convict? That's so, Bretton. I've no more doubt about it than I have that I see you. Marbury was in reality one John Maitland, a bank manager of Market Milcaster, who got 10 years penal servitude in 1891 for embezzlement. In 1891? Why, that's just about the time that Aylmore says he knew him. Exactly. And it just strikes me, said Spargo, sitting down at his desk and making a hurried note. It just strikes me. Didn't Aylmore say he knew Marbury in London? Certainly, replied Bretton, in London. Mused Spargo. That's queer, because Maitland had never been in London up to the time of his going to Dartmoor, whatever he may have done when he came out of Dartmoor, and of course Aylmore had gone to South America long before that. Look here, Breton, he continued aloud, have you access to Aylmore? Will you, can you, see him before he's brought up to Bow Street tomorrow? Yes, answered Breton, I can see him with his solicitor. Then listen, said Spargo. Tomorrow morning you'll find the whole story of how I proved Marbury's identity with Maitland in the Watchman. Read it as early as you can. Get an interview with Aylmore as early as you can. Make him read it, every word, before he's brought up. Beg him, if he values his own safety and his daughter's peace of mind, to throw away all that foolish reserve and to tell all he knows about Maitland 20 years ago. He should have done that at first. Why, I was asking his daughters some questions before you came in. They know absolutely nothing of their father's history previous to the time when they began to understand things. Don't you see that Aylmore's career, previous to his return to England, is a blank past? I know, said Breton. Yes, although I've gone there a great deal, I never heard Aylmore speak of anything earlier than his Argentine experiences. And yet he must have been getting on when he went out there. 37 or 8, at least, remarked Spargo. Well, Aylmore's more or less of a public man. And no public man can keep his life hidden nowadays. By the by, how did you get to know the Aylmores? My guardian, Mr. Elphick, and I met them in Switzerland, answered Breton. We kept up the acquaintance after our return. Mr. Elphick still interesting himself in the Marbury case? Asked Spargo. Very much so. And so is old Candlestone, at the foot of whose stairs the thing came off. I dined with them last night, and they talked of little else, said Breton. And their theory? Oh, still the murder for the sake of robbery, replied Breton. Old Candlestone is furious that such a thing could have happened at his very door. He says that there ought to be a thorough inquiry into every tenant of the temple. Longish business, that, observed Spargo. Well, run away now, Breton. I must write. Shall you be at Bow Street tomorrow morning? Asked Breton as he moved to the door. It's to be at 10:30. No, I shan't, replied Spargo. It'll only be a remand, and I know already just as much as I should hear there. I've got something much more important to do. But you'll remember what I asked of you. Get Aylmore to read my story in the Watchman and beg him to speak out and tell all he knows. All. And when Breton had gone, Spago again murmured those last words. All he knows. All. End of chapter 22. Recorded by Gesine in December 2006.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anita Roy Dobbs, Boston, December 2006. The Middle Temple Murder by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 23. Miss Bayliss. Next day, a little before noon, Spargo found himself in one of those pretentious yet dismal Bayswater squares, which are almost entirely given up to the trade, calling, or occupation of the lodging and boarding-house keeper. They are very pretentious, those squares, with their many-storied houses, their stuccoed frontages, and their pilastered and balconied doorways. Innocent country folk, coming into them from the neighbouring station of Paddington, take them to be the residences of the dukes and earls, who, of course, live nowhere else but in London. They are further encouraged in this belief by the fact that young male persons in evening dress are often seen in the doorways in more or less elegant attitudes. These, of course, are taken by the country folk to be young lords, enjoying the air of Bayswater, but others, more knowing, are aware that they are Swiss or German waiters, whose linen might be cleaner. Spargo gauged the character of the house at which he called as soon as the door was opened to him. There was the usual smell of eggs and bacon, of fish and chops, the usual mixed and ancient collection of overcoats, wraps, and sticks in the hall, the usual sort of parlour-maid to answer the bell, and presently, in answer to his inquiries, there was the usual type of landlady confronting him, a more than middle-aged person who desired to look younger, and made attempts in the way of false hair, teeth, and a little rouge, and who wore that somewhat air and smile which, in its wearer, under these circumstances, always means that she is considering whether you will be able to cheat her, or whether she will be able to cheat you. "You wish to see Miss Bayliss?" said this person, examining Spargo closely. "Miss Bayliss does not often see anybody." "I hope," said Spargo politely, "that Miss Bayliss is not an invalid." "No, she is not an invalid," replied the landlady. "But she's not as young as she was, and she's an objection to strangers. Is it anything I can tell her?" "No," said Spargo, "but you can, if you please, take her a message from me. Will you kindly give her my card, and tell her that I wish to ask her a question about John Maitland of Market Milcaster, and that I would be much obliged if she would give me a few minutes." "Perhaps you will sit down," said the landlady. She led Spargo into a room which opened out upon a garden. In it 2 or 3 old ladies, evidently inmates, were sitting. The landlady left Spargo to sit with them and to amuse himself by watching them knit or sew or read the papers, and he wondered if they always did these things, every day, and if they would go on doing them until a day would come when they would do them no more. And he was beginning to feel very dreary when the door opened and a woman entered whom Spargo, after one sharp glance at her, decided to be a person who was undoubtedly out of the common. And as she slowly walked across the room towards him, he let his first glance lengthen into a look of steady inspection. The woman whom Spargo thus narrowly inspected was of very remarkable appearance. She was almost masculine. She stood nearly 6 feet in height. She was of a masculine gait and tread, and spare, muscular, and athletic. What at once struck Spargo about her face was the strange contrast between her dark eyes and her white hair. The hair, worn in abundant coils round a well-shaped head, was of the most snowy whiteness. The eyes of a real coal-blackness, as were also the eyebrows above them. The features were well cut and of a striking firmness, the jaw square and determined. And Spargo's first thought on taking all this in was that Miss Bayliss seemed to have been fitted by nature to be a prison wardress, or the matron of a hospital, or the governess of an unruly girl, and he began to wonder if he would ever manage to extract anything out of those firmly locked lips. Miss Bayliss, on her part, looked Spargo over as if she was half-minded to order him to instant execution, and Spargo was so impressed by her that he made a profound bow and found a difficulty in finding his tongue. "Mr. Spargo," she said, in a deep voice which seemed peculiarly suited to her, "of, I see, the Watchman, you wish to speak to me." Spargo again bowed in silence. She signed him to the window near which they were standing. "Open the casement, if you please," she commanded him. "We will walk in the garden. This is not private." Spargo obediently obeyed her orders. She swept through the opened window, and he followed her. It was not until they had reached the bottom of the garden that she spoke again. "I understand that you desire to ask me some questions about John Maitland of Market Milcaster," she said. "Before you put it, I must ask you a question. Do you wish any reply I may give you for publication?" "Not without your permission," replied Spargo. "I should not think of publishing anything you may tell me except with your express permission." She looked at him gloomily, seemed to gather an impression of his good faith, and nodded her head. "In that case," she said, "what do you want to ask?" "I have lately had reason for making certain inquiries about John Maitland," answered Spargo. "I suppose you read the newspapers and possibly the Watchman, Miss Bayliss?" But Miss Bayliss shook her head. "I read no newspapers," she said. "I have no interest in the affairs of the world. I have work which occupies all my time. I give my whole devotion to it." Then you have not recently heard of what is known as the Marbury case, a case of a man who was found murdered?" asked Spargo. "I have not," she answered. "I am not likely to hear such things." Spargo suddenly realized that the power of the press is not quite as great, nor as far-reaching, as very young journalists hold it to be, and that there are actually, even in London, people who can live quite cheerfully without a newspaper. He concealed his astonishment and went on. "Well," he said, "I believe that the murdered man, known to the police as John Marbury, was in reality your brother-in-law, John Maitland. In fact, Miss Bayliss, I'm absolutely certain of it." He made this declaration with some emphasis, and looked at his stern companion to see how she was impressed, but Miss Bayliss showed no sign of being impressed. "I can quite believe that, Mr. Spargo," she said coldly. "It is no surprise to me that John Maitland should come to such an end. He was a thoroughly bad and unprincipled man, who brought the most terrible disgrace on those who were unfortunately connected with him. He was likely to die a bad man's death." "I may ask you a few questions about him?" suggested Spargo in his most insinuating manner. "You may, so long as you do not drag my name into the papers," she replied. "But pray, how do you know that I have the sad shame of being John Maitland's sister-in-law?" "I found that out at Market Milcaster," said Spargo. "The photographer told me, Cooper." "Ah!" she exclaimed. "The questions I want to ask are very simple," said Spargo, "but your answers may materially help me. You remember Maitland going to prison, of course?" Miss Bayliss laughed, a laugh of scorn. "Could I ever forget it?" she exclaimed. "Did you ever visit him in prison?" asked Spargo. "Visit him in prison!" she said indignantly. "Visits in prison are to be paid to those who deserve them, who are repentant, not to scoundrels who are hardened in their sin." "All right. Did you ever see him after he left prison?" "I saw him, for he forced himself upon me. I could not help myself. He was in my presence before I was aware that he had even been released." "What did he come for?" asked Spargo. "To ask for his son, who had been in my charge," she replied. "That's a thing I want to know about," said Spargo. "Do you know what a certain lot of people in Market Milcaster say to this day, Miss Bayliss? They say that you were in at the game with Maitland, that you had a lot of the money placed in your charge, that when Maitland went to prison, you took the child away, first to Brighton, then abroad, disappeared with him, and that you made a home ready for Maitland when he came out. That's what's said by some people in Market Milcaster." Mrs. Bayliss's stern lips curled. "People in Market Milcaster!" she exclaimed. "All the people I ever knew in Market Milcaster had about as many brains between them as that cat on the wall there. As for making a home for John Maitland, I would have seen him die in the gutter of absolute want before I would have given him a crust of dry bread." "You appear to have a terrible dislike for this man," observed Spargo, astonished at her vehemence. "I had, and I have," she answered. "He tricked my sister into a marriage with him when he knew that she would rather have married an honest man who worshipped her. He treated her with quiet, infernal cruelty. He robbed her and me of the small fortunes our father left us." "Ah!" said Spargo. "Well, so you say Maitland came to you when he came out of prison to ask for his boy. Did he take the boy?" "No. The boy was dead." "Dead, eh? Then I suppose Maitland did not stop long with you?" Miss Bayliss laughed her scornful laugh. "I showed him the door," she said. "Well, did he tell you that he was going to Australia?" inquired Spargo. "I should not have listened to anything that he told me, Mr. Spargo," she answered. "Then, in short," said Spargo, "you never heard of him again?" "I never heard of him again," she declared passionately, "and I only hope that what you tell me is true, and that Marbury really was Maitland." End of chapter 23.
is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Gesine. The Middle Temple Murder by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 24. Mother Gutch. Spargo, having exhausted the list of questions which he had thought out on his way to Bayswater, was about to take his leave of Miss Bayliss, when a new idea suddenly occurred to him, and he turned back to that formidable lady. "I've just thought of something else," he said. "I told you that I'm certain Marbury was Maitland, and that he came to a sad end, murdered. And I've told you," she replied scornfully, "that in my opinion no end could be too bad for him." "Just so, I understand you," said Spargo. "But I didn't tell you that he was not only murdered, but robbed of probably a good deal. There's a good reason to believe that he had securities, banknotes, loose diamonds and other things on him to the value of a large amount. He'd several £1,000s when he left Coolumbidgee in New South Wales, where he'd lived quietly for some years." Miss Bayliss smiled sourly. "What's all this to me?" she asked. "Possibly nothing. But you see, that money, those securities, may be recovered. And as the boy you speak of is dead, there surely must be somebody who's entitled to the lot. It's worth having, Miss Bayliss, and there's strong belief on the part of the police that it will turn up." This was a bit of ingenious bluff on the part of Spargo. He watched its effect with keen eyes. But Miss Bayliss was adamant, and she looked as scornful as ever. "I say again, what's all that to me?" she exclaimed. "Well, but hadn't the dead boy any relatives on his father's side?" asked Spargo. "I know you're his aunt on the mother's side, and as you're indifferent, perhaps I can find some on the other side. It's very easy to find all these things out, you know." Miss Bayliss, who had begun to stalk back to the house in gloomy and majestic fashion, and had let Spargo see plainly that this part of the interview was distasteful to her, suddenly paused in her stride and glared at the young journalist. "Easy to find all these things out?" she repeated. Spargo caught, or fancied he caught, a note of anxiety in her tone. He was quick to turn his fancy to practical purpose. "Oh, easy enough," he said. "I could find out all about Maitland's family through that boy. Quite easily." Miss Bayliss had stopped now, and stood glaring at him. "How?" she demanded. "I'll tell you," said Spargo with cheerful alacrity. "It is, of course, the easiest thing in the world to trace all about his short life. I suppose I can find the register of his birth at Market Milcaster, and you, of course, will tell me where he died. By the by, when did he die, Miss Bayliss?" But Miss Bayliss was going on again to the house. "I shall tell you nothing more," she said angrily. "I've told you too much already, and I believe all you're here for is to get some news for your paper. But I will at any rate tell you this. When Maitland went to prison his child would have been defenceless but for me. He'd have had to go to the workhouse but for me. He hadn't a single relation in the world but me, on either father's or mother's side. And even at my age, old woman as I am, I'd rather beg my bread in the street, I'd rather starve and die than touch a penny piece that had come from John Maitland. That's all." Then without further word, without offering to show Spargo the way out, she marched in at the open window and disappeared. And Spargo, knowing no other way, was about to follow her when he heard a sudden rustling sound in the shadow by which they had stood, and the next moment a queer, cracked, horrible voice, suggesting all sorts of things, said distinctly and yet in a whisper, "Young man!" Spargo turned and stared at the privet hedge behind him. It was thick and bushy, and in its full summer green, but it seemed to him that he saw a nondescript shape behind. "Who's there?" he demanded. "Somebody listening?" There was a curious cackle of laughter from behind the hedge. Then the cracked, husky voice spoke again. "Young man, don't you move or look as if you were talking to anybody. Do you know where the King of Madagascar public-house is in this quarter of town, young man?" "No," said Spargo, "certainly not." "Well, anybody'll tell you when you get outside, young man," continued the queer voice of the unseen person. "Go there, and wait at the corner by the King of Madagascar, and I'll come there to you at the end of half an hour. Then I'll tell you something, young man, I'll tell you something. Now run away, young man, run away to the King of Madagascar. I'm coming." The voice ended in a low, horrible cachinnation that made Spargo feel queer, but he was young enough to be in love with adventure, and he immediately turned on his heel without so much as a glance at the privet hedge, and went across the garden and through the house, and let himself out at the door. And at the next corner of the square he met a policeman and asked him if he knew where the King of Madagascar was. "First to the right, second to the left," answered the policeman tersely. "You can't miss it anywhere round here. It's a landmark." And Spargo found the landmark, a great, square-built tavern, easily, and he waited at a corner of it wondering what he was going to see, and intensely curious about the owner of the queer voice, with all its suggestions of he knew not what. And suddenly there came up to him an old woman and leered at him in a fashion that made him suddenly realize how dreadful old age may be. Spargo had never seen such an old woman as this in his life. She was dressed respectably, better than respectably. Her gown was good, her bonnet was smart, her smaller fittings were good. But her face was evil. It showed unmistakable signs of a long devotion to the bottle. The old eyes leered and ogled, the old lips were wicked. Spago felt a sense of disgust almost amounting to nausea, but he was going to hear what the old harridan had to say, and tried not to look what he felt. "Well?" said he almost roughly. "Well?" "Well, young man, there you are," said his new acquaintance. "Let us go inside, young man. There's a quiet little place where a lady can sit and take her drop of gin. I'll show you. And if you're good to me, I'll tell you something about that cat that you were talking to just now. But you'll give me a little matter to put in my pocket, young man. Old ladies like me have a right to buy little comforts, you know, little comforts." Spargo followed this extraordinary person into a small parlour within. The attendant, who came in response to a ring, showed no astonishment at her presence. He also seemed to know exactly what she required, which was a certain brand of gin, sweetened and warm. And Spargo watched her curiously, as with shaking hand she pushed up the veil which hid little of her wicked old face, and lifted the glass to her mouth, with a zest which was not thirst but pure greed of liquor. Almost instantly he saw a new light steal into her eyes, and she laughed in a voice that grew clearer with every sound she made. "Ha ha ha, young man," she said with a confidential nudge of the elbow that made Spargo long to get up and fly. "I wanted that. It's done me good. When I've finished that, you'll pay for another for me, and perhaps another. They'll do me still more good. And you'll give me a little matter of money, won't you, young man?" "Not till I know what I'm giving it for," replied Spargo. "You'll be giving it because I'm going to tell you that if it's made worth my while, I can tell you, or somebody that sent you, more about Jane Bayliss than anybody in the world. I'm not going to tell you that now, young man. I'm sure you don't carry in your pocket what I shall want for my secret. Not you, by the look of you. I'm only going to show you that I have the secret, eh?" "Who are you?" asked Spargo. The woman leered and chuckled. "What are you going to give me, young man?" she asked. Spargo put his fingers in his pocket and pulled out 2 half-sovereigns. "Look here," he said, showing his companion the coins. "If you can tell me anything of importance, you shall have these. But no trifling now, and no wasting of time. If you have anything to tell, out with it." The woman stretched out a trembling, claw-like hand. "But let me hold one of those, young man," she implored. "Let me hold one of the beautiful bits of gold. I shall tell you all the better if I hold one of them. Let me. There's a good young gentleman." Spargo gave her one of the coins and resigned himself to his fate, whatever it might be. "You won't get the other unless you tell me something," he said. "Who are you, anyway?" The woman, who had begun mumbling and chuckling over the half-sovereign, grinned horribly. "At the boarding-house yonder, young man, they call me Mother Gutch," she answered. "But my proper name is Mrs. Sabina Gutch, and once upon a time I was a good-looking young woman. And when my husband died, I went to Jane Bayliss as housekeeper, and when she retired from that and came to live in that boarding-house where we live now, she was forced to bring me with her and to keep me. Why had she to do that, young man?" "Heaven knows," answered Spargo. "Because I've got a hold on her, young man. I've got a secret of hers," continued Mother Gutch. "She'd be scared to death if she knew I'd been behind that hedge and had heard what she said to you, and she'd be more than scared if she knew that you and I were here, talking. But she's grown hard and near with me, and she won't give me a penny to get a drop of anything with, and an old woman like me has a right to her little comforts. And if you'll buy the secret, young man, I'll split on her, there and then, when you pay the money." "Before I talk about buying any secret," said Spargo, "you'll have to prove to me that you've a secret to sell that's worth my buying." "And I will prove it," said Mother Gutch with sudden fierceness. "Touch the bell, and let me have another glass, and then I'll tell you. Now," she went on more quietly. Spargo noticed that the more she drank, the more rational she became, and that her nerves seemed to gain strength, and her whole appearance to be improved. "Now, you came here to find out about her brother-in-law, Maitland, that went to prison, didn't you?" "Well?" demanded Spargo. "And what about that boy of his?" she continued. "You heard all that was said," answered Spargo. "I'm waiting to hear what you have to say." But Mother Gutch was resolute in having her own way. She continued her questions. "And she told you that Maitland came and asked for the boy, and that she told him the boy was dead, didn't she?" she went on. "Well?" said Spargo despairingly. "She did. What then?" Mother Gutch took an appreciative pull at her glass and smiled knowingly. "What then?" she chuckled. "All lies, young man. The boy isn't dead, any more than I am. And my secret is—" "Well?" demanded Spargo impatiently. "What is it?" "This," answered Mother Gutch, digging her companion in the ribs. "I know what she did with him." End of chapter 24. Recorded by Gesine in December 2006.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Corey Samuel. The Middle Temple Murder by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 25. Revelations. Spargo turned on his disreputable and dissolute companion with all his journalistic energies and instincts roused. He had not been sure, since entering the King of Madagascar, that he was going to hear anything material to the Middle Temple murder. He had more than once feared that this old gin-drinking harridan was deceiving him for the purpose of extracting drink and money from him. But now, at the mere prospect of getting important information from her, he forgot all about Mother Gutch's unfortunate propensities, evil eyes, and sodden face. He only saw in her somebody who could tell him something. He turned on her eagerly. "You say that John Maitland's son didn't die?" he exclaimed. "The boy did not die," replied Mother Gutch. "And that you know where he is?" asked Spargo. Mother Gutch shook her head. "I didn't say that I know where he is, young man," she replied. "I said I knew what she did with him." "What then?" demanded Spargo. Mother Gutch drew herself up in a vast assumption of dignity and favoured Spargo with a look. "That's the secret, young man," she said. "I'm willing to sell that secret, but not for 2 half-sovereigns and 2 or 3 drops of cold gin. If Maitland left all that money you told Jane Bayliss of, when I was listening to you from behind the hedge, my secret's worth something." Spargo suddenly remembered his bit of bluff to Miss Bayliss. Here was an unexpected result of it. "Nobody but me can help you trace Maitland's boy," continued Mother Gutch, "and I shall expect to be paid accordingly. That's plain language, young man." Spargo considered the situation in silence for a minute or two. Could this wretched, bibulous old woman really be in possession of a secret which would lead to the solving of the mystery of the Mid-Temple murder? Well, it would be a fine thing for the Watchman if the clearing up of everything came through one of its men. And the Watchman was noted for being generous, even to extravagance, in laying out money on all sorts of objects. It had spent money like water on much less serious matters than this. "How much do you want for your secret?" he suddenly asked, turning to his companion. Mother Gutch began to smooth out a pleat in her gown. It was really wonderful to Spargo to find how very sober and normal this old harridan had become. He did not understand that her nerves had been all a-quiver and on edge when he first met her, and that a resort to her favourite form of alcohol, in liberal quantity, had calmed and quickened them. Secretly he was regarding her with astonishment, as the most extraordinary old person he had ever met, and he was almost afraid of her as he waited for her decision. At last Mother Gutch spoke. "Well, young man," she said, "having considered matters, and having a right to look well to myself, I think that what I should prefer to have would be one of those annuities. A nice comfortable annuity, paid weekly, none of your monthlies or quarterlies, but regular and punctual every Saturday morning, or Monday morning, as was convenient to the parties concerned, but punctual and regular. I know a good many ladies in my sphere of life as enjoys annuities, and it's a great comfort to have 'em paid weekly." It occurred to Spargo that Mrs. Gutch would probably get rid of her weekly dole on the day it was paid, whether that day happened to be Monday or Saturday. But that, after all, was no concern of his, so he came back to first principles. "Even now you haven't said how much," he remarked. £3 a week," replied Mother Gutch. "And cheap, too." Spargo thought hard for 2 minutes. The secret might lead to something big. This wretched old woman would probably drink herself to death within a year or 2. Anyhow, a few hundreds of pounds was nothing to the Watchman. He glanced at his watch. At that hour, for the next hour, the great man of the Watchman would be at the office. He jumped to his feet, suddenly resolved and alert. "Here, I'll take you to see my principals," he said. "We'll run along in a taxicab." "With all the pleasure in the world, young man," replied Mother Gutch, "when you've given me that other half-sovereign. As for principals, I'd far rather talk business with masters than with men, though I mean no disrespect to you." Spargo, feeling that he was in for it, handed over the second half-sovereign and busied himself in ordering a taxicab. But when that came round, he had to wait, while Mrs. Gutch consumed a 3rd glass of gin, and purchased a flask of the same beverage to put in her pocket. At last he got her off, and in due course to the Watchman office, where the hall porter and the messenger boys stared at her in amazement, well used as they were to seeing strange folk, and he got her to his own room, and locked her in, and then he sought the presence of the mighty. What Spargo said to his editor, and to the great man who controlled the fortunes and workings of the Watchman, he never knew. It was probably fortunate for him that they were both thoroughly conversant with the facts of the Middle Temple murder, and saw that there might be an advantage in securing the revelations of which Spargo had got the conditional promise. At any rate, they accompanied Spargo to his room, intent on seeing, hearing, and bargaining with the lady he had locked up there. Spargo's room smelt heavily of unsweetened gin, but Mother Gutch was soberer than ever. She insisted upon being introduced to proprietor and editor in due and proper form, and in discussing terms with them before going into any further particulars. The editor was all for temporizing with her until something could be done to find out what likelihood of truth there was in her. But the proprietor, after sizing her up in his own shrewd fashion, took his two companions out of the room. "We'll hear what the old woman has to say on her own terms," he said. "She may have something to tell that really is of the greatest importance in this case. She certainly has something to tell. And, as Spargo says, she'll probably drink herself to death in about as short a time as possible. Come back, let's hear her story." So they returned to the gin-scented atmosphere, and a formal document was drawn out by which the proprietor of the Watchman bound himself to pay Mrs. Gutch the sum of £3 a week for life, Mrs. Gutch insisting on the insertion of the words, "every Saturday morning, punctual and regular." And then Mrs. Gutch was invited to tell her tale. And Mrs. Gutch settled herself to do so, and Spargo prepared to take it down, word for word. "Which the story, as that young man called it, is not so long as a monkey's tail, nor so short as a Manx cat's, gentlemen," said Mrs. Gutch, "but full of meat as an egg. Now you see, when that Maitland affair at Market Milcaster came off, I was housekeeper to Miss Jane Bayliss at Brighton. She kept a boarding house there, in Kemp Town, and close to the seafront, and a very good thing she made out of it, and had saved a nice bit, and having, like her sister Mrs. Maitland, had a little fortune left her by her father, as was at one time a publican here in London, she had a good lump of money. And all that money was in this here Maitland's hands, every penny. I very well remember the day when the news came about that affair of Maitland robbing the bank. Miss Bayliss, she was like a mad thing when she saw it in the paper, and before she'd seen it an hour she was off to Market Milcaster. I went up to the station with her, and she told me then, before she got in the train, that Maitland had all her fortune and her savings, and her sister's, his wife's too, and that she feared all would be lost." "Mrs. Maitland was then dead," observed Spargo, without looking up from his writing block. "She was, young man, and a good thing too," continued Mrs. Gutch. "Well, away went Miss Bayliss, and no more did I hear or see for nearly a week, and then back she comes and brings a little boy with her, which was Maitland's. And she told me that night that she'd lost every penny she had in the world, and that her sister's money, what ought to have been the child's, was gone too, and she said her say about Maitland. However, she saw well to that child, nobody could have seen better. And very soon after, when Maitland was sent to prison for 10 years, her and me talked about things. 'What's the use,' says I to her, 'of your letting yourself get so fond of that child, and looking after it as you do, and educating it, and so on?' I says. 'Why not?' says she. 'Tisn't yours,' I says. 'You haven't no right to it,' I says. 'As soon as ever its father comes out,' says I, 'he'll come and claim it, and you can't do nothing to stop him.' Well, gentlemen, if you'll all believe me, never did I see a woman look as she did when I says all that. and she up and swore that Maitland should never see or touch the child again, not under no circumstances whatever." Mrs. Gutch paused to take a little refreshment from her pocket flask, with an apologetic remark as to the state of her heart. She resumed presently, apparently refreshed. "Well, gentlemen, that notion about Maitland's taking the child away from her seemed to get on her mind, and she used to talk to me at times about it, always saying the same thing, that Maitland should never have him. And one day she told me she was going to London to see lawyers about it, and she went, and she came back seeming more satisfied, and a day or two afterwards there came a gentleman who looked like a lawyer, and he stopped a day or two, and he came again and again, until one day she came to me, and she says, 'You don't know who that gentleman is that's come so much lately,' she says. 'Not I,' says, 'unless he's after you.' 'After me,' she says, tossing her head. 'That's the gentleman that ought to have married my poor sister, if that scoundrel Maitland hadn't tricked her into throwing him over.' 'You don't say so,' I says. 'Then by rights he ought to have been the child's pa. He's going to be a father to the boy,' she says. 'He's going to take him and educate him in the highest fashion and make a gentleman of him,' she says, 'for his mother's sake.' 'Mercy on us,' says I, 'what'll Maitland say when he comes for him?' 'Maitland'll never come for him,' she says, 'for I'm going to leave here, and the boy'll be gone before then. This is all being done,' she says, 'so that the boy'll never know his father's shame. He'll never know who his father was.' And true enough, the boy was taken away, but Maitland came before she was gone, and she told him the child was dead, and I never see a man so cut up. However, it wasn't no concern of mine, and so there's so much of the secret, gentlemen, and I would like to know if I ain't giving good value." "Very good," said the proprietor. "Go on." But Spargo intervened. "Did you ever hear the name of the gentleman who took the boy away?" he asked. "Yes, I did," replied Mrs. Gutch. "Of course I did. Which it was Elphick." End of chapter 25.
Chapter 26. The Middle Temple Murder by J.S. Fletcher. Still Silent. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sean McGahey, Midland, Ontario, Canada. December 27th, 2006. Chapter 26. Still Silent. Spargo dropped his pen on the desk before him with a sharp clatter that made Mrs. Gutch jump. A steady devotion to the bottle had made her nerves to be none of the strongest, and she looked at the startler of them with angry malevolence. "Don't you do that again, young man," she exclaimed sharply. "I can't bear to be jumped out of my skin, and it's bad manners." "I observed that the gentleman's name was Elphick." Spargo contrived to get in a glance at his proprietor and his editor, a glance which came near to being a wink. "Just so, Elphick," he said. "A law gentleman, I think you said, Mrs. Gutch." "I said," answered Mrs. Gutch, "as how he looked like a lawyer gentleman. And since you're so particular, young man, though I wasn't addressing you but your principals, he was a lawyer gentleman. One of the sort that wears wigs and gowns. Ain't I seen his picture in Jane Bayliss's room at the boarding-house where you saw her this morning?" "Elderly man?" asked Spargo. "Elderly he will be now," replied the informant. "But when he took the boy away, he was a middle-aged man. About his age," she added, pointing to the editor in a fashion which made that worthy man wince and the proprietor desire to laugh unconsumedly. "And not so unlike him, neither, being one as had no hair on his face." "Ah," said Spargo. "And where did this Mr. Elphick take the boy, Mrs. Gutch?" But Mrs. Gutch shook her head. "Ain't no idea," she said. "He took him. Then, as I told you, Maitland came, and Jane Bayliss told him the boy was dead. And after that she never even told me anything about the boy. She kept a tight tongue. Once or twice I asked her, and she says, 'Never you mind,' she says, 'he's all right for life, if he lives to be as old as Methuselah.' And she never said more, and I never said more. But," continued Mrs. Gutch, whose pocket flask was empty, and who began to wipe tears away, "she's treated me hard, has Jane Bayliss, never allowing me a little comfort such as a lady of my age should have. And when I hears the two of you a-talking this morning, the other side of that privet hedge, thinks I, now's the time to have my knife into you, my fine madam. And I hope I done it." Spargo looked at the editor and the proprietor, nodding his head slightly. He meant them to understand that he had got all he wanted from Mother Gutch. "What are you going to do, Mrs. Gutch, when you leave here?" he asked. "You shall be driven straight back to Bayswater if you like." "Which I shall be obliged for, young man," said Mrs. Gutch, "and likewise for the first week of the annuity, and will call every Saturday for the same at 11 punctual, or can be posted to me on a Friday, whichever is agreeable to you gentlemen. And having my first week in my purse, and being driven to Bayswater, I shall take my boxes and go to a friend of mine, where I shall be hearty welcome, shaking the dust of my feet off against Jane Bayliss, and where I've been living with her." "Yes, but Mrs. Gutch," said Spargo with some anxiety, "if you go back there tonight, you'll be very careful not to tell Miss Bayliss that you've been here and told us all this?" Mrs. Gutch rose, dignified and composed. "Young man," she said, "you mean well, but you ain't used to dealing with ladies. I can keep my tongue as still as anybody when I like. I wouldn't tell Jane Bayliss my affairs. My new affairs, gentlemen, thanks to you. Not for 2 annuities, paid twice a week." "Take Mrs. Gutch downstairs, Spargo, and see her all right, and then come to my room," said the editor. "And don't you forget, Mrs. Gutch, keep a quiet tongue in your head, no more talk, or there'll be no annuities on Saturday mornings." So Spargo took Mother Gutch to the cashier's department and paid her her first week's money, and he got her a taxicab and paid for it, and saw her depart. And then he went to the editor's room, strangely thoughtful. The editor and the proprietor were talking, but they stopped when Spargo entered and looked at him eagerly. "I think we've done it," said Spargo quietly. "What precisely have we found out?" asked the editor. "A great deal more than I'd anticipated," answered Spargo, "and I don't know what fields it doesn't open out. If you look back, you'll remember that the only thing found on Marbury's body was a scrap of grey paper on which was a name and address. Ronald Breton, King's Bench Walk. "Well?" "Breton is a young barrister. Also, he writes a bit. I have accepted 2 or 3 articles of his for our literary page." "Well?" "Further, he is engaged to Miss Aylmore, the eldest daughter of Aylmore, the Member of Parliament, who has been charged at Bow Street today with the murder of Marbury." "I know. Well, what then, Spargo?" "But the most important matter," continued Spargo, speaking very deliberately, "is this. That is, taking that old woman's statement to be true, as I personally believe it is, that Breton, as he has told me himself, I have seen a good deal of him, was brought up by a guardian. That guardian is Mr. Septimus Elphick, the barrister." The proprietor and the editor looked at each other. Their faces wore the expression of men thinking on the same lines and arriving at the same conclusion. And the proprietor suddenly turned on Spargo with a sharp interrogation. "You think, then—" Spargo nodded. "I think that Mr. Septimus Elphick is the Elphick, and that Breton is the young Maitland of whom Mrs. Gutch has been talking," he answered. The editor got up, thrust his hands in his pockets, and began to pace the room. "If that's so," he said, "if that's so, the mystery deepens." What do you propose to do, Spargo? I think, said Spargo slowly, I think that without telling him anything of what we have learnt, I should like to see young Breton and get an introduction from him to Mr. Elphick. I can make a good excuse for wanting an interview with him, if you will leave it in my hands. Yes, yes, said the proprietor, waving a hand. Leave it entirely in Spargo's hands. Keep me informed, said the editor. Do what you think. It strikes me you're on the track. Spargo left their presence, and going back to his own room, still faintly redolent of the personality of Mrs. Gutch, got hold of the reporter who had been present at Bow Street when Aylmore was brought up that morning. There was nothing new. The authorities had merely asked for another remand. So far as the reporter knew, Aylmore had said nothing fresh to anybody. Spargo went round to the Temple and up to Ronald Breton's chambers. He found the young barrister just preparing to leave, and looking unusually grave and thoughtful. At the sight of Spargo, he turned back from his outer door, beckoned the journalist to follow him, and led him to an inner room. "I say, Spargo," he said as he motioned his visitor to take a chair, "this is becoming something more than serious. You know what you told me to do yesterday as regards Aylmore?" "To get him to tell all, yes," said Spargo. Breton shook his head. "Stratton, his solicitor, you know, and I saw him this morning before the police court proceedings," he continued. "I told him of my talk with you. I even went as far to tell him that his daughters had been to the Watchman office. Stratton and I both begged him to take your advice and tell all, everything, no matter at what cost to his private feelings. We pointed out to him the serious nature of the evidence against him, how he had damaged himself by not telling the whole truth at once, how he had certainly done a great deal to excite suspicion against himself, how, as the evidence stands at present, any jury could scarcely do less than convict him. And it was all no good, Spargo." "He won't say anything?" "He'll say no more. He was adamant. I told the entire truth in respect to my dealings with Marbury on the night he met his death at the inquest," he said over and over again, "and I shall say nothing further on any consideration. If the law likes to hang an innocent man on such evidence as that, let it." And he persisted in that until we left him. "Spargo, I don't know what's to be done." "And nothing happened at the police court?" "Nothing. Another remand. Stratton and I saw Aylmore again before he was removed. He left us with a sort of sardonic remark. 'If you all want to prove me innocent,' he said, 'find the guilty man.' Well, there was a tremendous lot of common sense in that," said Spargo. "Yes, of course. But how is it going to be done?" exclaimed Breton. "And are you any nearer? Is Rathbury any nearer? Is there the slightest clue that will fasten the guilt on anybody else?" Spargo gave no answer to these questions. He remained silent a while, apparently thinking. "Was Rathbury in court?" he suddenly asked. "He was," replied Breton. "He was there with 2 or 3 other men, I suppose were detectives, and seemed to be greatly interested in Aylmore." "If I don't see Rathbury tonight, I'll see him in the morning," said Spargo. He rose as if to go, but after lingering a moment, sat down again. "Look here," he continued. "I don't know how this thing stands in law, but would it be a very weak case against Aylmore if the prosecution couldn't show some motive for his killing Marbury?" Breton smiled. "There's no necessity to prove motive in murder," he said. "But I'll tell you what, Spargo. If the prosecution can show that Aylmore had a motive for getting rid of Marbury, if they could prove that it was to Aylmore's advantage to silence him, why then, I don't think he's a chance." "I see, but so far no motive, no reason for his killing Marbury has been shown." "I know of none." Spargo rose and moved to the door. "Well, I'm off," he said. Then, as if he suddenly recollected something, he turned back. "Oh, by the by," he said, "isn't your guardian Mr. Elphick a big authority on philately?" "One of the biggest. Awful enthusiast." "Do you think he'd tell me a bit about those Australian stamps which Marbury showed to Kreider the dealer?" "Certain he would. Delighted. Here." And Breton scribbled a few words on a card. "There's his address, and a word from me. I'll tell you when you can always find him in. 5 nights out of 7, at 9 o'clock, after he's dined. I'd go with you tonight, but I must go to Aylmore's. The 2 girls are in terrible trouble. Give them a message from me," said Spargo, as they went out together. "Tell them to keep up their hearts and their courage." End of chapter 26. Still silent.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are available in the public domain. For more information or to find out how to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Middle Temple Murder by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 27. Mr. Elphick's Chambers. Spago went round again to the temple that night at 9 o'clock, asking himself over and over again 2 questions. The first, how much does Elphick know? The second, how much shall I tell him? The old house in the temple to which he repaired, and in which many a generation of old fogies had lived since the days of Queen Anne, was full of stairs and passages, and as Spargo had forgotten to get the exact number of the set of chambers he wanted, he was obliged to wander about in what was a deserted building. So wandering, he suddenly heard steps, firm, decisive steps coming up a staircase which he himself had just climbed. He looked over the banisters down into the hollow beneath, and there, marching up resolutely, was the figure of a tall, veiled woman, and Spargo suddenly realized with a sharp quickening of his pulses that for the second time that day he was beneath one roof with Miss Bayliss. Spargo's mind acted quickly. Knowing what he now knew from his extraordinary dealings with Mother Gutch, he had no doubt whatever that Miss Bayliss had come to see Mr. Elphick. Come, of course, to tell Mr. Elphick that he, Spargo, had visited her that morning, and that he was on the track of the Maitland's secret history. He had never thought of it before, for he had been busily engaged since the departure of Mother Gutch. But naturally, Miss Bayliss and Mr. Elphick would keep in communication with each other. At any rate, here she was, and her destination was, surely, Elphick's chambers. And the question for him, Spargo, was what to do. What Spargo did was to remain in absolute silence, motionless, tense, where he was on the stair, and to trust to the chance that the woman did not look up. But Miss Bayliss neither looked up nor down. She reached a landing, turned along a corridor with decision, and marched forward. A moment later, Spargo heard a sharp double knock on a door. A moment after that, he heard a door heavily shut. He knew then that Miss Bayliss had sought and gained admittance somewhere. To find out precisely where that somewhere was, drew Spargo down to the landing which Miss Bayliss had just left. There was no one about. He had not, in fact, seen a soul since he entered the building. Accordingly, he went along the corridor into which he had seen Miss Bayliss turn. He knew that all the doors in the house were double ones, and that the outer oak in each was solid and substantial enough to be soundproof. Yet, as men will under such circumstances, he walked softly. He said to himself, smiling at the thought, that he would be sure to start if somebody suddenly opened a door on him. But no hand opened any door, and at last he came to the end of the corridor and found himself confronting a small board on which was painted in white letters on a black ground, Mr. Elphick's Chambers. Having satisfied himself as to his exact whereabouts, Spargo drew back as quickly as he had come. There was a window halfway along the corridor from which he had noticed as he came along, one could catch a glimpse of the embankment and the Thames. To this he withdrew, and leaning on the sill, looked out and considered matters. Should he go? And if he could gain admittance, beard these two conspirators? Should he wait until the woman came out and let her see that he was on the track? Should he hide again until she went and then see Elphick alone? In the end, Spargo did none of these things immediately. He let things slide for the moment. He lighted a cigarette and stared at the river and the brown sails and the buildings across on the Surrey side. 10 minutes went by. 20 minutes. Nothing happened. Then, as 9:30 struck from all the neighboring clocks, Spargo flung away a second cigarette, marched straight down the corridor, and knocked boldly at Mr. Elphick's door. Greatly to Spargo's surprise, the door was opened before there was any necessity to knock again, and there, calmly confronting him, a benevolent yet somewhat deprecating expression on his spectacled and placid face, stood Mr. Elphick, a smoking cap on his head, a tasselled smoking jacket over his dress shirt, and a short pipe in his hand. Spargo was taken aback. Mr. Elphick apparently was not. He held the door well open and motioned the journalist to enter. "Come in, Mr. Spargo," he said. "I was expecting you. Walk forward into my sitting room." Spargo, much astonished at this reception, passed through an anteroom into a handsomely furnished apartment full of books and pictures. In spite of the fact that it was still very little past midsummer, there was a cheery fire in the grate, and on a table set near a roomy armchair was set such creature comforts as a spirit case, a siphon, a tumbler, and a novel, from which things Spargo argued that Mr. Elphick had been taking his ease since dinner. But in another armchair on the opposite side of the hearth was the forbidding figure of Miss Bayliss, blacker, gloomier, more mysterious than ever. She neither spoke nor moved when Spargo entered. She did not even look at him. And Spargo stood staring at her until Mr. Elphick, having closed his doors, touched him on the elbow and motioned him courteously to a seat. "Yes, I was expecting you, Mr. Spargo," he said, as he resumed his own chair. "I've been expecting you at any time ever since you took up your investigation of the Marbury affair, in some of the earlier stages of which you saw me, you will remember, at the mortuary. But since Miss Bayliss told me 20 minutes ago that you had been to her this morning, I felt sure that it would not be more than a few hours before you would come to me." "Why, Mr. Elphick, should you suppose that I should come to you at all?" asked Spargo, now in full possession of his wits. "Because I felt sure that you would leave no stone unturned, no corner unexplored," replied Mr. Elphick. "The curiosity of the modern pressman is insatiable." Spargo stiffened. "I have no curiosity, Mr. Elphick," he said. "I am charged by my paper to investigate the circumstances of the death of the man who was found in Middle Temple Lane, and, if possible, to track his murderer, and—" Mr. Elphick laughed silently and waved his hand. "My good young gentleman," he said, "you exaggerate your own importance. I don't approve of modern journalism, nor of its methods. In your own case, you have got hold of some absurd notion that the man John Marbury was in reality one John Maitland, once of Market Milcaster, and you've been trying to frighten Miss Bayliss here into—" Spargo suddenly rose from his chair. There was a certain temper in him which, when once roused, led him to straight hitting, and it was roused now. He looked the old barrister full in the face. "Mr. Elphick," he said, "you're evidently unaware of all that I know, so I will tell you what I will do. I will go back to my office and I will write down what I do know, and give the true and absolute proofs of what I know. And if you will trouble yourself to read the Watchman tomorrow morning, then you too will know." Dear me, said Mr. Elphick banteringly. "We're so used to the ultra-sensational stories from the Watchman that—" "But I'm a curious and inquisitive old man, my good young sir," So perhaps you will tell me in a word what it is you do know, eh? Spargo reflected for a second. Then he bent forward across the table and looked the old barrister straight in the face. Yes, he said quietly. I will tell you what I know beyond doubt. I know that the man murdered under the name of John Marbury was, without doubt, John Maitland of Market Milcaster, and that Ronald Breton is his son, whom you took from that woman. If Spago had desired a complete revenge for the cavalier fashion in which Mr. Elphick had treated it, he could not have been afforded a more ample one than that offered to him by the old barrister's reception of this news. Mr. Elphick's face not only fell, but changed. His expression of almost sneering contempt was transformed to one clearly resembling abject terror. He dropped his pipe, fell back in his chair, recovered himself, gripped the chair's arms, and stared at Spargo as if the young man had suddenly announced to him that in another minute he must be led to instant execution. And Spargo, quick to see his advantage, followed it up. That is what I know, Mr. Elphick, and if I choose, all the world shall know tomorrow morning, he said firmly. Ronald Breton is the son of the murdered man, and Ronald Breton is engaged to be married to the daughter of the man charged with the murder. Do you hear that? It is not a matter of suspicion, or of idea, or of conjecture. It is fact. Fact. Mr. Elphick slowly turned his face to Miss Bayliss. He gasped out a few words. You did not... Then Spargo, turning to the woman, saw that she too was white to the lips and as frightened as the man. I didn't know, she muttered. He didn't tell me. He only told me this morning what I've told you. Spargo picked up his hat. Good night, Mr. Elphick, he said. But before he could reach the door, the old barrister had leapt from his chair and seized him with trembling hands. Spargo turned and looked at him. He knew then that for some reason or the other he had given Mr. Septimus Elphick a thoroughly bad fright. Well, he growled. My dear young gentleman, implored Mr. Elphick, don't go. I'll do anything for you if you won't go away to print that. I'll give you £1,000. Spargo shook him off. That's enough, he snarled. Now I'm off. What? You try to bribe me? Mr. Elphick wrung his hands. I didn't mean that. Indeed I didn't, he almost wailed. I don't know what I meant. Stay, young gentleman. Stay a little and let us talk. Let me have a word with you, as many words as you please. I implore you. Spargo made a fine pretence of hesitation. If I stay, he said at last, it will only be on the strict condition that you answer, and answer truly, whatever questions I like to ask you. Otherwise... He made another move to the door, and again Mr. Elphick laid beseeching hands on him. Stay, he said. I'll answer anything you like. End of chapter 27. Recorded by Kritika from India.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Middle Temple Murder by J.S. Fletcher, Chapter 28, of Proved Identity. Spargo sat down again in the chair which he had just left, and looked at the two people upon whom his startling announcement had produced such a curious effect, and he recognized as he looked at them that while they were both frightened, they were frightened in different ways. Miss Bayliss had already recovered her composure. She now sat sombre and stern as ever, returning Spargo's look with something of indifferent defiance. He thought he could see that in her mind a certain fear was battling with a certain amount of wonder that he had discovered the secret. It seemed to him that so far as she was concerned, the secret had come to an end. It was as if she said in so many words that now the secret was out, he might do his worst. But upon Mr. Septimus Elphick the effect was very different. He was still trembling from excitement. He groaned as he sank into his chair, and the hand with which he poured out a glass of spirits shook. The glass rattled against his teeth when he raised it to his lips. The half-contemptuous fashion of his reception of Spargo had now wholly disappeared. He was a man who had received a shock, and a bad one. And Spargo, watching him keenly, said to himself, "This man knows a great deal more than, a great deal beyond, the mere fact that Marbury was Maitland, and that Ronald Bretton is in reality Maitland's son. He knows something which he never wanted anyone to know, which he firmly believed it impossible anyone ever could know." It was as if he had buried something deep, deep down in the lowest depths, and was astounded as he was frightened to find that it had been at last flung up to the broad light of day. "I shall wait," suddenly said Spargo, "until you are composed, Mr. Elphick. I have no wish to distress you, but I see of course that the truths which I have told you are a sort that cause you considerable, shall we say, fear." Elphick took another stiff pull at his liquor. His hand had grown steadier, and the color was coming back to his face. "If you will let me explain," he said, "if you will hear what was done for the boy's sake, eh?" "That," answered Spargo, "is precisely what I wish. I can tell you this, I am the last man in the world to wish harm of any sort to Mr. Bretton." Miss Bayliss relieved her feelings with a scornful sniff. "He says that," she exclaimed, addressing the ceiling. "He says that knowing that he means to tell the world in his rag of a paper that Ronald Bretton, on whom every care has been lavished, is the son of a scoundrel, an ex-convict, a—" Elphick lifted his hand. "Hush, hush," he said imploringly. "Mr. Spargo means well, I'm sure. I am convinced. If Mr. Spargo will hear me—" But before Spargo could reply, a loud, insistent knocking came at the outer door. Elphick started nervously, but presently he moved across the room, walking as if he had received a blow, and to open the door. A boy's voice penetrated into the sitting-room. "If you please, sir, is Mr. Spargo of the Watchman here? He left this address in case he was wanted." Spargo recognized the voice as that of one of the office messenger boys, and jumping up, went to the door. "What is it, Rawlings?" he asked. "Will you please come back to the office, sir, at once? There's Mr. Rathbury there, and he says he must see you instantly." "All right," said Spargo. "I'm coming just now." He motioned the lad away and turned to Elphick. "I shall have to go," he said. "I may be kept. Now, Mr. Elphick, can I come to see you tomorrow morning?" "Yes, yes, tomorrow morning," replied Elphick eagerly. "Tomorrow morning, certainly. At 11 o'clock. That will do?" "I shall be here at 11, said Spargo. 11 sharp." He was moving away when Elphick caught him by the sleeve. "A word, just a word," he said. You have not told the boy, Ronald, of what you know? You haven't." "I haven't," replied Spargo. Elphick tightened his grip on Spargo's sleeve. He looked into his face beseechingly. Promise me, Mr. Spargo, that you won't tell him until you've seen me in the morning," he implored. "I beg you to promise me this." Spargo hesitated, considering the matters. "Very well, I promise," he said. "And you won't print it," continued Elphick, still clinging to him. "Say you won't print it tonight." "I shall not print it tonight," answered Spargo. "That's certain." Elphick released his grip on the young man's arm. "Come, at 11 tomorrow morning," he said, and drew back and closed the door. Spargo ran quickly to the office and hurried up to his own room. And there, calmly seated in an easy-chair, smoking a cigar and reading an evening newspaper, was Rathbury, unconcerned and outwardly as imperturbable as ever. He greeted Spargo with a careless nod and a smile. "Well," he said, "how's things?" Spargo, half breathless, dropped into his desk chair. "You didn't come here to ask me that," he said. Rathbury laughed. "No," he said, throwing the newspaper aside, "I didn't. I came to tell you my latest. You're at full liberty to stick it into your paper tonight. It may just as well be known." "Well?" said Spargo. Rathbury took his cigar out of his lips and yawned. "Almore's identified," he said lazily. Spargo sat up sharply. "Identified?" "Identified, my son, beyond doubt." "But as whom? As what?" exclaimed Spargo. Rathbury laughed. "He's an old lag, an ex-convict. Served his time partly at Dartmoor. That, of course, is where he met Maitland or Marbury. D'ye see? Clear as noontide now, Spargo." Spargo sat drumming his fingers on the desk before him. His eyes were fixed on a map of London that hung on the opposite wall. His ears heard the throbbing of the printing machine far below. But what he really saw was the faces of two girls. What he really heard was the voices of two girls. "Clear as noontide," repeated Rathbury with great cheerfulness. Spargo came back to the earth of plain and brutal fact. "What's clear as noontide?" he asked sharply. "Why, the whole thing. Motive, everything," answered Rathbury. "Don't you see? Maitland and Almore, his real name is Ainsworth, by the by, met at Dartmoor, probably, or rather certainly, just before Aylmore's release. Aylmore goes abroad, makes money, in time comes back, starts a new career, gets into Parliament, becomes a big man. In time, Maitland, who after his time has also gone abroad, also comes back. The two meet. Maitland probably tries to blackmail Aylmore, or threatens to let folk know that the flourishing Mr. Aylmore, M.P., is an ex-convict. Result, Aylmore lures him to the Temple and quietens him. Pooh! The whole thing's clear as noontide. As I say, as noontide." Spargo drummed his fingers again. "How," he asked quietly, "how came Almore to be identified?" "My work," said Rathbury proudly. "My work, my son. You see, I thought a lot. And especially after we'd found out that Marbury was Maitland." "You mean after I'd found out," remarked Spargo. Rathbury waved his cigar. "Well, well, it's all the same," he said. "You help me and I help you, eh? Well, as I say, I thought a considerable lot. I thought, now, where did Maitland or Marbury know or meet Almore 22 years ago? Not in London, because we knew Maitland was never in London, at any rate before his trial, and we haven't the least proof that he was in London after. And why won't Almore tell? Clearly because it must have been in some undesirable place. And then, all of a sudden, it flashed on me in a moment of, what do you writing fellows call those moments, Spargo?" "Inspiration, I should think," said Spargo. "Direct inspiration." "That's it. In a moment of direct inspiration. It flashed on me. Why, 20 years ago Maitland was in Dartmoor. They must have met there. And so we got some old warders who'd been there at the time to come down, and we gave 'em opportunities to see Aylmore and to study him. Of course he's 20 years older, and he's grown a beard, but they began to recall him, and then one man remembered that if he was the man they thought, he'd have a certain birthmark, and he has." "Does Almore know he's been identified?" asked Spargo. Rathbury pitched his cigar into the fireplace and laughed. "No," he said scornfully. "No. He's admitted it. What was the use of standing out against proof like that? He admitted it tonight in my presence. Oh, he knows all right." "And what did he say?" Rathbury laughed contemptuously. "Say? Oh, not much. Pretty much what he said about this affair, that when he was convicted the time before he was an innocent man. He's certainly a good hand at playing the innocent game." "And of what was he convicted?" "Oh, of course we know all about it, now. As soon as we found out who he really was, we had all the particulars turned up. Aylmore, or Ainsworth, Stephen Ainsworth his name really is, was a man who ran a sort of what they call a mutual benefit society in a town right away up in the north, Cloudhampton, some 30 years ago. He was nominally secretary, but it was really his own affair. It was patronized by the working classes. Cloudhampton's a purely artisan population, and they stuck a lot of their brass, as they call it, in it. Then suddenly it came to a smash, and there was nothing. He, Ainsworth, or Aylmore, pleaded that he was robbed and duped by another man. But the court didn't believe him, and he got 7 years. Plain story, you see, Spargo, when it all comes out, eh?" "All stories are quite plain when they come out," observed Spargo. "And he kept his silence now, I suppose, because he didn't want his daughters to know about his past?" "Just so," agreed Rathbury, "and I don't know that I blame him. He thought, of course, that he'd go scot-free over this Marbury affair, but he made his mistake in the initial stages, my boy. Oh, yes." Spargo got up from his desk and walked around his room for a few minutes, Rathbury meanwhile finding and lighting another cigar. At last Spargo came back and clapped a hand on the detective's shoulder. "Look here, Rathbury," he said, "it's very evident that you're now going on the lines that Almore did murder Marbury, eh?" Rathbury looked up. His face showed astonishment. "After evidence like that?" he exclaimed. "Why, of course. There's the motive, my son, the motive." Spargo laughed. "Rathbury," he said, "Almore no more murdered Marbury than you did." The detective got up and put on his hat. "Oh," he said, "perhaps you know who did, then." "I shall know in a few days," answered Spargo. Rathbury stared wonderingly at him. Then he suddenly walked to the door. "Good night," he said gruffly. "Good night, Rathbury," replied Spargo, and sat down at his desk. But that night Spargo wrote nothing for the watchman. All he wrote was a short telegram addressed to Almore's daughters. There were only 3 words on it: "Have no fear." End of chapter 28.